In this video, I'll explain the integration between vSphere 7 and NSXT 3.0, and we'll talk about the differences between the N-VDS and the vSphere distributed switch. So, prior to NSXT 3.0, we really only had this one option, the N-VDS, and we saw this in the last lesson. Basically, everything related to the N-VDS is managed strictly within NSXT. And this is great for non-vSphere environments like KVM or bare metal. But let's take a step back and think about this from an implementation perspective. Let's say that we have an existing vSphere environment and we're looking to do a brownfield deployment of NSXT. So we already have a vSphere distributed switch deployed. And odds are, if we already have a vSphere distributed switch deployed, most of the physical adapters, most of the VMNICs that you have available on these ESXi hosts, these VMNICs are going to be dedicated to the vSphere distributed switch. So how do I handle setting up an N-VDS on top of that? I'm going to have to take adapters away from that vSphere distributed switch and give them to the N-VDS. But what about the virtual machines? I still have virtual machines on that vSphere distributed switch, virtual machines that have not been migrated to NSXT yet. And now I'm taking adapters away from that vSphere distributed switch and giving them to the N-VDS. So what I may end up with here is a situation in which I don't have enough physical adapters to support both running at the same time, and I have to do some big cutover, or I have to buy physical adapters just to supplement while I'm in this transition period. So that can be a real headache when transitioning away from an existing vSphere distributed switch environment to NSXT. Now, let's think about utilizing the VDS instead. And by the way, the N-VDS is going to be deprecated in a future release. Now we'll talk about that. It's not going to be deprecated for KVM, and it's not going to be deprecated for bare metal, but it is going to be deprecated for ESXi hosts that are transport nodes. So, with the release of vSphere 7, came the vSphere Distributed Switch 7.0. And this version of the vSphere Distributed Switch now supports NSXT distributed port groups. So I can use the same vSphere Distributed Switch for NSXT 3.0 and for vSphere 7 networking simultaneously. I could create layer 2 segments in NSXT, and those layer 2 segments would exist on top of this same vSphere distributed switch. So here's a layer 2 segment. And by the way, I've also got my distributed port groups, and I've got those running on the same underlying vSphere distributed switch with the same underlying set of physical adapters. Now I don't have to pull adapters away from the existing platform to put them on an N-VDS. So this is one of the major advantages of using the VDS instead of having a separate switching mechanism with the N-VDS. But there's also one more very significant benefit to the integration of NSXT 3.0 with vSphere 7. And it comes down to microsegmentation. So let's assume that that's the reason you want to roll out NSXT. You want microsegmentation. The other stuff is great, but you don't really care about the other stuff so much. You're not really interested in distributed routing or edge services or stuff like that. You're buying NSXT strictly for microsegmentation purposes. Now, I know we really haven't started talking about microsegmentation yet, but let me break it down in very simple terms. So here I've got two virtual machines, and let's assume that these two virtual machines are connected to the same port group on the same vSphere distributed switch. And what I want to do is establish a set of firewall rules. So let's assume that VM1 is a web server. Well, we're going to have traffic flowing in, hitting VM1, and we also want to allow some traffic to leave VM1, flow to VM2, which is providing a database for the web server. And so we don't necessarily want the same type of traffic that's allowed to hit VM1. We don't want to allow that web traffic to hit VM2. We want to open up a very specific set of openings for VM2. It should only be traffic coming from VM1, and it should be only traffic that's on a port connecting to my database. So ideally, what I'll have here is a set of firewall rules attached to VM1 and a different set of firewall rules attached to VM2, even though those virtual machines are on the same layer 2 network, even though those virtual machines are connected to the same port group on the vSphere distributed switch, I want to give them different sets of firewall rules. And so that's what microsegmentation is all about, giving me the ability to set up firewall rules on an individual virtual machine by virtual machine basis. And that's one of the major features of NSXT. Well, what I can do with vSphere 7 and NSXT 3.0 is I could install NSXT. I could use a vSphere distributed switch as my switch for NSXT, and then I am immediately able to start creating these microsegmentation rules. So I could create these microsegmentation rules for virtual machines, even though I haven't migrated them to an NSXT segment. And that's a huge benefit. If you're really just trying to get to this point where you can do microsegmentation and you don't want to configure all of the other features of NSXT, you just want microsegmentation, you don't have to re-architect your network here. You can just roll out NSXT and start creating microsegmentation rules on the virtual machines that are already connected to your existing port groups. So just bear in mind that the N-VDS, that's the host switch that we're going to install and control with the NSXT user interface, that will be deprecated in a future release. And going forward, the plan is to converge NSXT and ESXi host switches. However, the N-VDS is not going to be completely deprecated. It's going to remain for KVM, for the NSXT edge nodes, and for bare metal workloads. So the N-VDS is only being deprecated on ESXi host transport nodes and not on the other types of transport nodes. And we'll really have to wait for a future release to see exactly how all of this plays out. There is a transition path from N-VDS to VDS. It involves manual steps, and you should be contacting VMware support to help you with that transition if you want to do that. But the bottom line right now is if you are in a pure vSphere environment and you're rolling out NSXT 3.0, you should be using the vSphere distributed switch as the underlying switch for NSXT.